gods have never run out of creative ways to make someone's life miserable. We've already covered the classics, the golden touch has gone wrong, the eternal boulders, the bound tricksters, but the divine catalog of suffering has more pages than anyone asked for, so we're back. More punishments, more myths, more proof that you really did not want to be on the wrong side of the ancient world. Actaeon. Actaeon was a hunter, a genuinely great one, trained by the centaur Chiron, respected across the region, beloved by his hounds. He had everything a Greek hero needed: skill, reputation, and the catastrophic misfortune of taking a wrong turn in the forest on a warm afternoon. He stumbled into a secluded grotto and walked straight into the sight of Artemis, goddess of the hunt, bathing with her nymphs. No sneaking, no plan, just a man who took a wrong path and suddenly had the worst view in the ancient world. Artemis didn't pause to consider intent. She didn't ask questions, offer warnings, or accept apologies. She reached down, grabbed a handful of water, and splashed it on him. And Actaeon began to change. His neck stretched, his hands curled into hooves. Antlers forced their way out of his skull. Within moments, the greatest hunter in the region had become a stag, and his dogs, the ones he had raised from pups, named individually, trained with patience, caught his scent on the wind and started running. They didn't recognize him. Why would they? He smelled like prey. He tried to shout his own name at them. The sounds that came out were not human. His pack ran him into the ground and tore him apart in the very forest he'd spent his life mastering. The lesson people usually extract from this is something about respecting divine boundaries, but the actual lesson is darker than that. Artemis didn't punish Actaeon because he was wicked or proud or scheming. She punished him because he was there. Wrong place, wrong goddess, and the appeal process didn't exist. Marsyas, some competitions you are genuinely better off losing early. Marsyas, a satyr from Phrygia, found a flute that Athena had discarded because she decided playing it puffed her cheeks out and looked undignified. Marsyas picked it up, practiced relentlessly, and eventually became remarkable. Remarkable enough that people started making comparisons. Comparisons to Apollo, the god of music. And instead of letting that rumor quietly flattering him while he kept his mouth shut, Marsyas agreed to a formal contest. Against Apollo himself, that's not ambition. That's constructing your own funeral and sending out invitations. The terms were simple. Best musician wins the right to do whatever they want with the loser. They played. The muses judged. And here's where it turned slippery. Apollo flipped his lyre upside down and kept playing, then challenged Marsyas to match the trick with his flute. You cannot play a flute upside down. Physically impossible. Apollo had essentially smuggled a cheat code into a fair fight. The muses declared him the winner anyway, because voting against the god of music tends not to go well for anyone involved. Apollo, the deity of harmony, beauty, and enlightened civilization, had Marsyas tied to a pine tree and skinned him alive. Every layer. Rivers were said to flow from the tears of the satyrs who mourned him. A river in Phrygia was named after him. His skin was supposedly displayed near the water for centuries. A permanent reminder mounted at the scene of the crime. The moral isn't about skill or preparation or even fairness. It's simpler than that. If a god challenges you to a contest, they have already decided how it ends. The music was just the decoration on top. Io's crime was being beautiful. That's the beginning and end of the explanation. She was a priestess of Hera, which in hindsight was already a dangerous occupation given Zeus's habits. Zeus noticed her, pursued her, and when Hera started asking pointed questions about where he'd been, Zeus did the most reasonable thing available to a king of the gods. He turned Io into a white cow and tried to act completely normal. Hera, who was not born yesterday, admired the cow and asked for it as a gift. Zeus couldn't say no without essentially confirming everything, so Io, who is now a cow, was handed over to his wife as a present. Hera then stationed the 100-eyed giant Argus to guard her around the clock. Some eyes always open, always watching, no gaps, no windows, no sleep. Scheduled to exploit, no shift change to time, just 100 eyes rotating through consciousness in permanent relay, making escape not just difficult but cosmically impossible. Zeus eventually sent Hermes to deal with the situation. Hermes killed Argus by telling him a story so monotonous that even a creature with 100 eyes couldn't keep any of them open. Hera took Argus's eyes after he died and scattered them across the tail of a peacock as a memorial, which is the origin of those markings apparently. But Io wasn't free, not close. Hera sent a gadfly after her next, a single relentless insect whose only purpose was to sting her constantly, driving her into a blind panic that never stopped. She ran across Greece, through the sea that still carries her name, the Ionian Sea, through Scythia, Egypt, covering the ancient world in a frantic loop with a divine fly always just behind her. There was no outrunning it, no country far enough, no terrain difficult enough. The gadfly didn't need rest. She was eventually restored to human form in Egypt and connected to the goddess Isis. Happy ending technically, technically, after being a tormented cow for what could have been years, persecuted for something that was done to her rather than by her. Zeus really should have had better self-control, though if he had, mythology would be significantly shorter. Lycaon was the king of Arcadia, and he had a theory. His theory was that Zeus was not actually divine, just powerful, and powerful things could be verified. When Zeus arrived in the region traveling in disguise, as he frequently did, Lycaon decided to conduct an experiment. He killed a prisoner, cooked the flesh, and served it to his divine guest at dinner, just to see if Zeus would notice the difference, or react in a way that confirmed godhood. Some versions say he also planned to murder Zeus in his sleep afterward, just to see if that was even possible. The man was thorough, if nothing else. This was, by any measure, a catastrophic miscalculation. Zeus noticed. The table flipped. The palace caught fire. Lycaon ran, making it into the night air outside. And that's when the transformation started. The running shifted. The posture dropped. The hands came down and became paws. Lycaon, king of Arcadia, came out the other side of his experiment as a wolf. In many traditions, this is the origin point for lycanthropy itself. The werewolf mythology, the idea of humans shifting into wolves, the full moon associations, the whole framework traces back to this single king who decided Zeus was testable. The punishment was precise in a way that feels deliberate. He fed human flesh to a god. Fine. He could spend the rest of his existence as a creature that hunts flesh in the dark. He questioned divine nature. Fine. He'd become something no one would ever confuse for divine. He wanted to run a test on a god's power. Fine. He could spend eternity running on 4 legs with no kingdom left to rule and no subjects left to impress. What sets Lycaon apart from the other cautionary tales is the sheer audacity of what he did. He had a god at his table and thought, this seems like the right moment for an experiment. There's something almost impressive about that confidence. It was obviously spectacularly wrong, but the man invented the werewolf myth by failing at hospitality, which is a legacy few cautionary tales can match. Pentheus was the king of Thebes and a firmly rational man, which in Greek mythology functions less as a virtue and more as a countdown. When Dionysus arrived in the city with his cult of wine, ecstatic ritual, and general divine chaos, Pentheus responded the way any sensible ruler would. He banned it. He had Dionysus arrested, didn't recognize him as a god, and had him chained up in the palace dungeon, which is roughly equivalent to trying to confiscate the ocean. Dionysus walked out of the chains without effort, let the palace shake itself apart, and then switched tactics entirely from force to psychology. He didn't raise an army. He got inside Pentheus's head. He suggested that if Pentheus really wanted to understand what the women of Thebes were doing out in the hills during their rituals, he should go and look. In disguise, as a woman, Pentheus agreed because Dionysus was adjusting his thinking the entire time. He climbed a tree at the edge of the ritual site to get a better vantage point. That's when Dionysus pointed him out to the women below who were deep in the frenzy. His own mother, Agave, leading the Maenads, grabbed the tree and brought it down. She tore his arm from his body. Her own son. The others joined in, and Pentheus was dismembered piece by the people who had loved him most. Agave carried his head back toward Thebes on a spike, still in the trance, believing she'd hunted a lion. When the madness cleared and she looked at what was in her hands, the horror of that realization destroyed something in her that never recovered. Dionysus didn't deliver punishment from a distance. He engineered it from the inside. Pentheus wasn't just killed, he was unraveled by his own family, and his mother had to survive knowing what her hands had done. Callisto was a huntress and companion of Artemis, which meant she'd sworn a vow of chastity. Zeus, who treated such vows as mild suggestions, disguised himself as Artemis herself to approach her. She became pregnant. When Artemis discovered it during a group swim, she cast Callisto out immediately. No hearing, no context, just gone. Then Hera, who maintained excellent awareness of Zeus's movements, decided expulsion from the hunting party wasn't nearly sufficient. She transformed Callisto into a bear. Not symbolically, a real bear, 4 legs, dark fur, fully animal, unable to speak or explain or be recognized as anything except prey. Callisto had been a hunter all her life. She knew exactly how hunters thought, how they tracked, how they cornered things, how they finished them. Now she was the thing they were looking for. Every instinct she'd spent years sharpening was now working against her survival. She spent years in the forest, alone, hiding, completely stripped of language and identity. Her son Arcas grew up without knowing what had happened to his mother. One afternoon, hunting in the forest, he came face to face with with a bear that moved toward him in a way no bear should, drawn by something it couldn't explain. He raised his spear. He had no idea what he was looking at. Zeus intervened at the final moment, swept them both into the sky, and placed them among the stars. Callisto became Ursa Major. Her son became Botas, or Ursa Minor, depending on the version. The stars are beautiful. They genuinely are. But the path to get there included violation, blame, transformation, years of silent terror, and almost being killed by your own child. The divine upgrade at the end doesn't erase what came before it. Callisto's story is less a punishment for something she did and more a document of what it looked like to be collateral damage in Zeus's wake, which, for the people involved, usually felt identical. Echo was a mountain nymph with a remarkable gift for conversation. She was articulate, clever, and could hold attention effortlessly, which was both her defining quality and eventually her destruction. Hera would descend from Olympus to catch Zeus conducting one of his many affairs among the nymphs, and Echo would intercept her. Long, winding, genuinely entertaining conversations that kept Hera occupied just long enough for the evidence to disappear. When Hera eventually worked out what was happening, her response was economical and devastating. She stripped Echo of the ability to initiate speech entirely. From that point forward, Echo could only repeat the final words someone else had spoken to her. That was all. The most talkative nymph on the mountain, reduced to a living delay in someone else's conversation. She couldn't start a sentence, couldn't warn anyone, comfort anyone, or say a single word that hadn't already been said to her first. Then she encountered Narcissus in the forest and fell for him completely, helplessly, with no tools whatsoever to express it. She could only follow him through the trees, mirroring fragments of whatever he said back at him. When he finally turned and demanded she leave him alone, all she could return was alone, 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 the words dissolving behind her as she retreated into the rocks and wilderness. She faded gradually, not dying so much as diminishing, until nothing remained except her voice, bouncing from cliff faces and canyon walls. Narcissus, for his part, eventually fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away staring at it, which is poetic in a grim sort of way. Hera's punishment was almost elegant in how targeted it was. She didn't take Echo's life, didn't transform her into something monstrous. She took the specific thing that defined Echo and converted it into a permanent humiliation. A woman who filled silence with her own words, now condemned to fill silence exclusively with other people's. You can still hear her. Every time sound bounces back from stone, that's Echo, still there, still only allowed to answer. Salmoneus, king of Elis, had a plan so ambitious it deserves a moment of genuine respect before we discuss how thoroughly it destroyed him. The plan was to be Zeus, not rule in Zeus's name, not claim divine favor, not erect a few temples and call himself blessed. He wanted to actually impersonate the king of the gods directly and in real time. He built a bronze bridge and drove his chariot across it at speed to generate a sound resembling thunder. He threw burning torches into crowds as a substitute for lightning. He renamed himself Zeus, demanded worship as the sky god, and made his subjects address him accordingly. For a while, inexplicably, it worked. People went along with it, whether out of conviction or simple self-preservation, the historical record doesn't clarify. But the actual Zeus was watching from above, observing a man on a bronze bridge with a handful of torches rattling around and telling everyone he was the king of the gods. The response was not measured. The thunderbolts came down, and Salmoneus, his fake thunder apparatus, his city, and everyone in the immediate vicinity were incinerated with a completeness that left nothing worth discussing. The city of Salmoneus ceased to exist. There were no ruins, no survivors worth recording, just an empty patch of land where a king had once built a contraption to imitate a god, until the god he was imitating decided he'd seen enough. What lifts Salmoneus above most overreachers in mythology is the commitment. He didn't brag carelessly or let pride slip out at the wrong moment. He built the infrastructure. He had a system. He was methodical about his own erasure, which somehow makes it more impressive and more catastrophic at the same time. Bellerophon had a career that most Greek heroes would have retired on gladly. He tamed Pegasus using a golden bridle gifted by Athena herself. He killed the Chimera, the three-animal fire-breathing nightmare that nobody else had managed to deal with. He defeated armies, repelled multiple attempts on his life, completed tasks that had been designed as death sentences. By any reasonable measure, he was among the finest heroes Greece had produced. And then he made the one mistake mythology absolutely cannot forgive. He decided he deserved to fly Pegasus all the way to Olympus Olympus and take his place among the gods. Not visit, not be honored by them, join them. He saddled up, pointed at the sky, and started climbing. Zeus, watching this from above, sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus mid-ascent. The horse bucked hard and Bellerophon fell. He didn't fall into the sea in some dramatic final moment. He just came back down to Earth slowly, as if the universe had simply switched off whatever had been powering his rise. He survived the landing, which in many respects was the worst possible outcome. He was left lame, reportedly blinded in some versions, wandering across the plains alone, shunned by both gods and mortals, his former glory apparently making it worse rather than better. No more heroic tasks, no more invitations. Just a broken man moving through a landscape that had no place for him until he died somewhere in the wilderness with no one recording where. Pegasus, for what it's worth, made it to Olympus without difficulty, got a stable, a purpose, and a permanent job carrying Zeus's thunderbolts. The horse received the promotion Bellerophon was reaching for. If the universe was trying to send a message about where Bellerophon belonged, it made it fairly clear. Cain committed the first murder. His brother Abel was a shepherd whose offerings were better received by God, and Cain, who had given what he had as a farmer and still felt passed over, reached a point he couldn't come back from. He took Abel into a field and killed him. When God asked where his brother was, Cain said he didn't know and asked if he was his brother's keeper. That is either the first recorded lie in human history or the most extraordinary deflection ever attempted, depending on how you read it. God wasn't buying it. He cursed Cain so the ground itself would refuse to yield for him. No more farming. The entire skill and purpose that had structured his life simply cut off. He would wander instead, rootless, a fugitive on the earth, belonging to nowhere and no one. But then Cain said something surprising. He complained that the punishment was too severe, that anyone who found him would kill him. And God agreed, which is itself a remarkable moment in the text, and placed a mark on him. Not a mark of shame, a mark of protection. Anyone who killed Cain would receive 7 times the vengeance in return. So the mark wasn't an invitation to judgment. It was a guarantee that the punishment couldn't be ended by anyone else, which means Cain got the most precisely designed sentence in the entire tradition. He couldn't farm, he couldn't settle, he couldn't be killed. He had to keep living, marked, known, carrying the weight of what he'd done through every landscape and every generation, with no execution date and no fixed term. It is the oldest exile story ever written, and it works because the punishment was never about the ending. It was about the enduring. Shakuntala's curse. Shakuntala's story starts as something close to perfect. King Dushyanta was hunting in the forest when he arrived at the hermitage of the sage Kanva and found Shakuntala, his adopted daughter, raised among deer and river light. They fell in love with the kind of immediacy that myths tend to allow and were married in the forest by the Gandharva ceremony, a union sealed in love without formal witness. Dushyanta gave her his royal signet ring as a promise, swore he would send for her, and rode back to court. While Shakuntala waited, lost in thoughts of him to the point where the world around her blurred, the powerful sage Durvaza arrived at the hermitage expecting to be welcomed. She didn't notice him, didn't greet him, didn't offer the ritual hospitality that sacred duty required because she was too deep inside her own daydream. Durvaza, who was notoriously incapable of absorbing any slight without responding with maximum force, cursed her immediately. The one she was thinking of would forget her completely, every memory of her erased. When Shakuntala finally made the journey to the capital, heavily pregnant, expecting to be received as the king's wife, Dushyanta looked at her and felt nothing. No flicker of recognition, no memory at all. She was turned away from the gates. A pregnant woman standing before a king, insisting she was his wife, unable to prove it because the ring that could break the curse had slipped from her finger into the river during the journey. The ring eventually reappeared inside a fish caught by a fisherman, because mythology runs on that kind of timing, and Dushyanta's memory came flooding back. But Shakuntala had already spent years raising their son alone in the wilderness, punished because she was too busy thinking about the man she loved to notice a passing sage. Even by the standards of divine punishment, that one was a stretch. Utgard Loki's humiliation of Thor is the god of thunder. He is, by general consensus across the 9 realms, the strongest being in Asgard. He kills giants. He protects humanity. He wields Mjolnir, a hammer that can level mountains. He does not lose. And then he visited Utgard, the great fortress of the giant known as Utgard Loki, and spent the entire visit losing comprehensively at absolutely everything. He lost an eating contest against someone who consumed the wooden table along with the food. He lost a drinking competition despite 3 enormous attempts at a horn that turned turned out to be connected to the actual ocean. He lost a wrestling match against an old woman named Ellie, who brought him to one knee without appearing to strain. She was, as revealed afterward, the physical embodiment of old age itself, and nobody in any realm defeats old age. He failed memorably to lift a cat fully off the ground. The cat was Jormungandr, the world serpent disguised. Getting a single paw airborne was apparently considered impressive by those who knew what they were looking at. When Utgard-Loki finally walked Thor and his companions to the fortress gates to send them off, he stood outside the walls, which then vanished completely, because he understood that if Thor knew what had actually happened, there would be nothing left of the area. He explained each illusion carefully. The foot race had been against thought itself, which nothing outruns. The drinking horn connected to the ocean. Thor had moved the actual world serpent. He had nearly outpaced the tide. Objectively, looked at clearly, Thor had performed extraordinary feats, but the framing had made every single one look like an embarrassing failure in front of his own companions. There was no giant left to hit. The fortress was already gone. The only thing that remained was the sound of laughter from a place that no longer existed, which is arguably the most effective punishment Thor ever received, and Mjolnir was completely useless against it. If you want more myths, monsters, and legendary chaos delivered straight to you, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if you're already hungry for more, there's a suggested video right there. Click it, you won't regret it.